The spring of 1940 was not merely a military defeat. It was the catastrophic unraveling of a world order. For months, the phony war had fostered a fragile, deceptive sense of stalemate in the West. But on the 10th of May, 1940, the German war machine, the Blitzkrieg, erupted with a violence and speed that shattered all preconceived notions of modern combat. The main German assault did not come through the heavily fortified Maginot Line, as French High Command had stubbornly anticipated. Instead, panzer divisions, the spearhead of General von Rundstedt's Army Group A, sliced through the dense, supposedly impenetrable Ardennes forest. This was a masterstroke of tactical deception and audacious risk. The French and British Expeditionary Force, or BF, along with their Belgian and Dutch allies, were completely wrong-footed. The German forces, a rolling tide of steel and fire, exploded out of the Ardennes and raced towards the English Channel. Their objective was not just to gain territory, but to annihilate. The strategy was to cut the Allied forces in two, isolating the British and the French First Army Group in the north from the main French armies to the south. It was a classic pincer movement on a grand, devastating scale. Communication lines collapsed, headquarters were overrun, and a paralyzing fog of war descended upon the Allied leadership. The speed of the German advance was incomprehensible. Towns and cities fell not in days, but in hours. The French army, once considered the finest in Europe, was caught in a state of strategic and psychological paralysis, its doctrine of methodical, linear defense rendered utterly obsolete by the German emphasis on speed, initiative, and deep penetration. By the 20th of May, the vanguard of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the coast at Abbeville. The trap was sprung. The British Expeditionary Force, under Lord Gort, along with significant remnants of the French and Belgian armies, found themselves with their backs to the sea, compressed into a shrinking pocket around the channel port of Dunkirk and its surrounding beaches. The situation was, by any conventional military metric, hopeless. The entire BEF, the professional corps of the British Army, was cornered. They were low on ammunition, food, and water, and under constant attack from the Luftwaffe, which enjoyed total air superiority. From Berlin and from the Führer's headquarters, the view was one of certain, impending victory. The British Army was not just beaten, it was on the verge of being erased. Capture or annihilation seemed inevitable. In London, the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was forced to deliver a devastating report to the House of Commons, admitting the gravity of the news and the hard and heavy tidings that the entire BEF was in peril. What happened next was one of the most pivotal and inexplicable decisions of the war. Just as the German panzers, poised for the final crushing blow, received the order to halt. For 3 critical days, from the 24th to the 27th of May, the German ground assault stalled. The reasons remain debated by historians to this day. Some attribute it to Hermann Göring's boast that his Luftwaffe alone could destroy the encircled army from the air, denying the army a share of the glory. Others point to the cautiousness of German high command, worried about the marshy terrain around Dunkirk unsuited for tanks and the need to preserve their armored strength for the final defeat of France. Hitler himself may have seen it as a political gesture, a chance to offer Britain a peace deal from a position of overwhelming strength once her army was humiliated but not destroyed. Regardless of the motive, this halt was a fatal error. It provided a miraculous, fragile, breathing space. It was a window the British would exploit with every ounce of their will. Operation Dynamo was launched, a desperate, almost fantastical plan to evacuate the army by sea from the beaches of Dunkirk. The call went out for every available vessel. The Royal Navy's destroyers were the backbone, but they were joined by an absurd, heroic armada: paddle steamers, fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, and Thames River barges, the famous little ships of Dunkirk. Civilians, from old sea captains to young boys, sailed across the channel into a war zone, braving Stuka dive bomber attacks and shell fire. On the beaches, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Thousands of soldiers stood in long, snaking queues in the water, waiting for rescue. while others formed a desperate perimeter, fighting a fierce rearguard action to hold the collapsing pocket together. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered and operating at the extreme limit of its range, threw every available fighter into the sky above Dunkirk, contesting for air superiority in a furious, unseen battle that the exhausted soldiers on the beaches often cursed, unaware of the sacrifices being made for them overhead. By the time Operation Dynamo ended on June 4th, over 338,000 Allied soldiers had been miraculously rescued. But Churchill was swift to warn the British people. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. The BEF was saved, but it was a broken force. It had been forced to abandon virtually all of its tanks, trucks, artillery, rifles, and supplies on the beaches. Britain now stood alone, militarily crippled, facing the most powerful war machine the world had ever seen. The victory in Germany was palpable. The war in the West, they believed, was all but over. All that remained was for the British to see reason, to surrender, and to accept the new order in Europe. The stage was set for the greatest political and psychological test in British history, and for the man who would define it. While the soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force were forming desperate queues in the shallows off Dunkirk, a battle of a different, but no less consequential, kind was raging in the corridors of power in London. The nation was not just militarily cornered. It was politically paralyzed, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and defeatism. The miraculous evacuation from France, though a testament to British pluck and organization, could not mask the stark reality. Britain had suffered the most catastrophic military defeat in its modern history. The army had been hurled from the continent, and the specter of a German invasion now loomed over the white cliffs of Dover. In this hour of supreme crisis, the very heart of the British government was faltering, and the question of leadership became a question of national survival. At the center of this storm was Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister who had returned from Munich in 1938, proclaiming peace for our time, was now the architect of a policy widely seen as a disastrous failure. Appeasement had not prevented war. It had merely delayed it and allowed Hitler to grow stronger. The failed British campaign in Norway, which had seen troops landed and then hastily evacuated in the face of German aggression, was the final blow. It proved that the current government was incapable of waging a vigorous war. The House of Commons, in a series of dramatic debates on the 7th and 8th of May, 1940, turned on its leader. The mood was one of fury and despair. Members from all parties who had once supported Chamberlain now stood to deliver scathing indictments of his leadership. The most symbolic moment came from the conservative backbencher Leo Amery, who, echoing Cromwell's famous dismissal of the Rump Parliament, thundered across the chamber at Chamberlain. "You have sat too long here for any good you have been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." The government's majority evaporated. Though Chamberlain narrowly won a vote of confidence, the writing was on the wall. The political base necessary to lead a coalition war effort had been shattered. He was a mortally wounded prime minister. The question of his successor, however, was fraught with tension and carried immense implications for the future of the war. The two primary candidates were Winston Churchill and Lord Halifax. To the outside world, and particularly to the watching Germans, the choice seemed obvious: Halifax. He was the foreign secretary, the senior statesman, the calm, aristocratic diplomat. He represented the established order, the voice of reason, and it was widely believed, both in London and in Berlin, that Halifax was prepared to seek a negotiated peace with Hitler. Using the still neutral Mussolini as an intermediary, Halifax argued for exploring what terms Germany might offer. To him, this was pragmatism. With the army disarmed, France collapsing, and America isolationist, could Britain realistically fight on alone? Would it not be wiser to secure the best possible terms now, rather than face certain invasion and subjugation later? This was the defining crisis. The war cabinet was locked in a series of tense, secret meetings. The fate of the British Empire, and indeed of the free world, hung in the balance. Churchill, Though a member of the War Cabinet and First Lord of the Admiralty, was by no means the guaranteed successor. He was distrusted by large sections of his own conservative party, who viewed him as a volatile maverick, a man with a checkered past who had changed parties and whose judgment was often questioned. His warnings about the Nazi threat throughout the 1930s, though now proven correct, had marked him as an alarmist and a warmonger. Many in the establishment saw him as a dangerous liability. But in those critical meetings, Churchill waged a political battle as determined as any military campaign. He argued against any exploration of terms with a ferocious and uncompromising passion. He knew that to enter into negotiations from a position of such profound weakness would be to surrender. Hitler would demand the disarmament of the fleet, the cession of bases, and, effectively, British subservience to the Third Reich. There would be no honorable peace, only a slow, humiliating death for the British Empire. Churchill's argument was simple, stark, and revolutionary. Britain would fight on. There would be no deal. He forced his colleagues to confront the brutal arithmetic of the situation, not from a position of strength, but from a position of defiant will. The nation might be beaten, but it was not broken. To sue for peace was to lose everything. To fight on was to preserve honor and the chance, however slim, of a future victory. The pivotal moment came on May 28th. In a meeting with the full cabinet, a body larger than the interwar cabinet and containing many ministers who were not privy to the earlier discussions of surrender, Churchill delivered a speech of raw, breathtaking power. He laid out the full, terrifying extent of their peril, holding nothing back. And then he declared that should Britain, his own country, chose to surrender, he himself would personally go down fighting in the streets, never laying down his arms. This was not the calculated language of diplomacy. It was the roar of a cornered lion. It electrified the room. The cabinet, which had been wavering, rallied behind him unanimously. The wind went out of Halifax's sails. The push for negotiation was dead. On May 10th, 1940, the same day, the Blitzkrieg smashed into France and the Low Countries. Neville Chamberlain resigned. With the nation literally under the first blows of the German onslaught, Winston Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace and asked by King George VI to form a government. He had won the political battle, but as he stood on the steps of number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister for the first time, he inherited a nation on the brink of collapse, a military in tatters, and a world expecting his surrender. The battle for Britain's political soul was over. The battle for its very existence was about to begin. The morning of May 10th, 1940, dawned with a sense of apocalyptic finality. As Winston Churchill slept, German paratroopers were descending on the Netherlands. Panzer divisions were crushing Luxembourg, and the great thrust through the Ardennes was beginning. The phone call from Buckingham Palace, summoning him to form a government, came amidst the cacophony of a continent shattering. There was no time for ceremony, no transition period, no grace. He was stepping onto the bridge of the ship of state at the precise moment it was entering the most violent of storms. His first day as Prime Minister was not an inauguration. It was a mobilization, a declaration of war not just on the external enemy, but on the internal spirit of defeatism that had brought Britain to the brink. Churchill's arrival at the Admiralty on that first day was electric. He did not come with a detailed, 100-point plan for economic reform or social policy. He came with a single, burning purpose: to wage war. And he understood that to wage war effectively, he needed to command not just the military, but the entire machinery of government with an iron will and unshakable resolve. His first acts were a whirlwind of decisive, symbolic, and practical moves designed to send a shockwave through the bureaucracy and establish a new, relentless tempo. The age of hesitation was over. His first and most crucial decision was the formation of a true national government, a coalition of all parties. He immediately offered key positions to the Labour Party, which had refused to serve under Chamberlain. Clement Attlee became Lord Privy Seal, Ernest Bevin a powerful Minister of Labour, and A.V. Alexander returned to the Admiralty. This was not merely a political necessity. It was a masterstroke. It isolated the hardline Chamberlain loyalists who still viewed Churchill with suspicion and brought the organized might of the trade unions, through Bevan, directly into the war effort. It signaled to the nation that this was no longer a conservative war, but Britain's war. Every resource, every class, every party would be harnessed. Next, he created the core instrument through which he would direct the conflict, a small, streamlined war cabinet of only 5 men. Churchill himself, as Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, would be its unquestioned head. Chamberlain and Halifax were included, a shrewd move to maintain party unity and keep potential dissidents inside the tent. But their influence was now checked. The 2 Labour members, Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, provided balance. This small, agile committee was designed for speed and secrecy. There would be no more endless, dithering debates in large, leak-prone cabinets. Decisions would be made here, rapidly, and executed immediately. But the most telling moments of that first day were not in the committee rooms. They were in his personal conduct and his instructions to the government machine. He immediately established a new, punishing, and relentless routine that would characterize his leadership. He began working from his bed in the morning, reading intelligence reports, and dictating memos to his secretaries. He demanded that all reports be submitted on a single side of paper, with crisp, concise summaries. He issued a stream of minutes and directives, marked in red with the urgent stamp, "Action this day." These were not vague inquiries. They were specific, probing, and demanded immediate answers. He asked for details on the stockpiles of weapons, on the production of aircraft, on the state of the Home Guard. He was, in effect, conducting an audit of the nation's will and its resources on his first day in office. His personal staff felt the change instantly. Where Chamberlain had been reserved and formal, Churchill was a force of nature. He worked through the night, fueled by determined energy and a belief that sheer force of will could shape events. He installed a personal map room next to his bedroom in the Admiralty, where he could track the movement of every ship and every division. He was immersing himself in the granular details of the war, becoming not just a political leader, but a de facto supreme commander. The symbolic break with the past was also absolute. He refused to use Chamberlain's study at number 10 Downing Street for some time, preferring his old quarters at the Admiralty. This was a physical manifestation of the new regime. He was distancing himself from the ghosts of appeasement, from the very atmosphere of failure. He surrounded himself with military advisors like General Ismay and scientists like Professor Frederick Lindemann, his personal advisor on the application of science to warfare, signaling embrace of modern technological conflict. By the end of that first, impossibly long day, the transformation was already underway. The political crisis was over. The question of leadership had been answered not with a consensus, but with a coronation of iron will. A new, ruthless efficiency was being imposed upon the government. The machinery, rusty and slow from years of indecision, was being forced to spin at a revolutionary speed. Churchill had not waited for a mandate or a period of settling in. He had seized the levers of power and begun to pull them with all his strength. He had established his authority, built his war-fighting machine, and set a new, defiant tone. But the British public did not know this yet. They knew only that a new, controversial man was now in charge, and that the news from France was getting worse by the hour. The stage was now set for him to explain himself, to define the nature of the struggle ahead, and to ask a broken, frightened nation to follow him into the fire. The government had been mobilized. Now, it was time to mobilize the people. On May 13th, 1940, 3 days after becoming Prime Minister, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons. The atmosphere was thick with apprehension, skepticism, and the palpable fear of impending doom. The members of Parliament, and through them the British people, were waiting for an answer. They had replaced their leader at the moment of greatest peril. Now they needed to know what this new, pugnacious, and often unpredictable man would do. They expected a detailed plan, a strategic overview, a glimmer of hope. What they received was something far more powerful, far more primal, and far more enduring. A statement of pure, unadulterated resolve. The speech he delivered, forever known by its most famous phrase, was not a blueprint for victory, but a declaration of the price he and the nation were prepared to pay for the mere possibility of it. Churchill began not with boasts or optimism, but with a sober, almost brutal acknowledgement of the formalities of power. He requested the House to approve the formation of the new national government, listing the key appointments. This was procedural, but it served a crucial purpose. It established his legitimacy and the broad, cross-party foundation of his administration. He was showing a united front, a coalition of all national talent, before he laid out the grim reality they all faced. He was building his credibility before making his unprecedented demand. Then he pivoted. He laid out the new government's policy. And here, he stripped away all political nicety, all strategic obfuscation, and delivered one of the most stunningly simple and powerful statements of intent in political history. "You ask, what is our policy?" he said, his voice growing in force. "I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalog of human crime. That is our policy." The answer was not negotiation, not a defensive posture, not a re-evaluation of goals. The answer was war, total war, uncompromising va. He defined the enemy not just as a geopolitical rival, but as a moral abomination, framing the conflict in the starkest terms of good versus evil. This was a crusade, and there would be no quarter. He followed with the second, inevitable question. "You asked, what is our aim?" The answer was just as direct, just as revolutionary in its simplicity. "I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival." The repetition of the word victory was a rhythmic hammer blow, driving the point home with relentless force. He offered no caveats, no conditions. He did not speak of victory if possible or an honorable peace. He spoke of victory as the only conceivable outcome, the only aim that mattered. The phrase "at all costs" was a blank check drawn on the nation's blood, treasure, and spirit. It was a terrifying and electrifying commitment. It was only after establishing this unshakable policy and aim that he delivered the lines that would echo through history and define his premiership. He prepared the nation for the cost. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." This was the antithesis of a normal political promise. He was not offering prosperity or security or ease. He was offering suffering. He was offering a trial by fire. The genius of this phrase lies in its order and its raw physicality. Blood comes first, the ultimate sacrifice, the literal offering of life. Toil follows, the endless, back-breaking work of a nation at total war. Tears, the grief for the lost, the pain of separation, the cost in human sorrow. And finally, sweat, the constant grinding effort and anxiety of the struggle. It was a comprehensive catalog of the hardship to come, presented not as a threat, but as an offering, the only currency he had. The speech's structure was a masterclass in rhetorical power. He began with the practical, the new government, moved to the philosophical, the policy of total war, defined the ultimate objective, victory at all costs, and finally laid out the human price, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He took his audience on a journey from the procedural to the sublime, from the formation of a cabinet to the summoning of a national spirit. He did not hide the truth. He weaponized it. By stating the worst so frankly, he robbed it of its power to shock and demoralize. He was inoculating the nation against despair. The reaction in the House was not one of cheers, but of a solemn, grim acceptance. He had respected the intelligence and the courage of the British people by telling them the unvarnished truth. He had treated them as adults capable of bearing the terrible burden he was placing upon them. He concluded by linking their shared fate to the vast, impersonal forces of history, asking for the support of all men and women in the land, and declaring, Come then, let us go forward together with our united strength. He was no longer just the prime minister reporting to Parliament. He was the captain rallying his crew for a voyage into a hurricane. He had offered no easy path, no guarantee of success, only a promise of unyielding struggle and a share in the glory of survival. In 5 minutes, he had redefined the very meaning of leadership in a democracy at war. He had taken a nation staring into the abyss and convinced it not to flinch, but to clench its fists. The speech was a shock to the system, a cold, bracing draft of reality that, paradoxically, ignited a fire of defiance. The world was listening, and for the first time, it heard not the whimper of a dying empire, but the clear, defiant roar of a lion that refused to lie down. From the eagle's nest in Berchtesgaden to the wolf's lair in East Prussia, the German High Command observed the unfolding political drama in London with a sense of supreme, unshakable confidence. Their calculus was rooted in a cold, logical appraisal of the situation, an appraisal that, by every conventional measure of power politics, was undeniably correct. Britain was beaten. Her army had fled the continent, abandoning its entire arsenal on the beaches of Dunkirk. Her sole major ally, France, was in its death throes, with German troops marching down the Champs-Élysées. The United States remained isolationist, a distant and neutral giant. The German Wehrmacht was the most powerful, experienced, and victorious military force on earth. To the German mind, particularly to Adolf Hitler, the British response was a foregone conclusion. They would be rational. They would sue for peace. This belief was not born of mere wishful thinking. It was a core component of Nazi ideology and strategic thinking. Hitler had always expressed a certain admiration for the British Empire, which he saw as a kind of Aryan cousin to his own envisioned Germanic Reich. In his view, the war in the West had been an unfortunate but necessary squabble to secure Germany's rear before the main event, the crusade against Bolshevik Russia. The real enemy was in the East. A protracted war with Britain was a pointless, costly distraction. He and his generals fully expected that with the demonstration of German invincibility now complete, the British ruling class, the same aristocrats who had pursued appeasement so fervently, would see reason. They would depose the warmonger Churchill, who was viewed in Berlin as a drunken, irrelevant dilettante, and install a sensible government under a figure like Lord Halifax, who would negotiate a settlement. The German press, tightly controlled by Joseph Goebbels, began preparing the public for the imminent British capitulation. The war, for all intents and purposes, was considered one. The broadcast of Churchill's speech to the British public and the reports of the reaction it received therefore landed in Berlin like a psychological bombshell. The initial reaction was not one of anger, but of sheer, uncomprehending disbelief. The German leadership had been waiting for the white flag. Instead, they received a declaration of total war. They had expected an appeal for terms. They received a promise of blood, toil, tears, and sweat. To the logical, power-based mindset of a Nazi high command, Churchill's stance was not just defiant. It was insane. It was a rejection of reality itself. How could a nation so clearly and utterly defeated, with its back to the wall and no visible means of salvation, possibly choose to fight on? It made no strategic, economic, or military sense. This was Hitler's fundamental miscalculation. He understood the logic of force, but he failed to comprehend the power of national will when galvanized by a leader who speaks not to its fears, but to its pride and its principles. He had calculated Britain's material position with perfect accuracy, but he had completely misjudged its spirit. The policy of appeasement had not been a sign of inherent national cowardice, but a policy pursued by a specific government. Churchill, in his first speech, had successfully tapped into a far deeper, more stubborn national character, the same spirit that had resisted Napoleon and defined the British under the Blitz of the previous war. He had replaced the language of realpolitik with the language of moral absolutism, and in doing so, he rendered the German logic obsolete. The shock in Berlin quickly curdled into fury. Hitler felt personally insulted. His magnanimous. In his view, opportunity for a reasonable peace had been thrown back in his face by a nation he considered already prostrate. The failure of Britain to capitulate was a direct challenge to his own prestige and to the myth of German invincibility. If Britain refused to acknowledge its defeat, then the victory in the West was incomplete. This psychological blow was a critical turning point. It forced Hitler to confront a scenario his war plans had never seriously considered, a prolonged war against a determined naval and air power that he could not immediately reach with his invincible army. The immediate consequence was the issuance of Directive No. 16 for the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But Sea Lion was a contingency plan born of frustration and strategic necessity, not of confident design. The German army was a continental force. It had no specialized landing craft, no experience in amphibious warfare, and its mighty navy was a fraction of the size of the Royal Navy. For an invasion to have any chance of success, the Luftwaffe first had to achieve what was now deemed an urgent prerequisite: air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. The Battle of Britain was thus initiated not as a pre-planned, deliberate campaign, but as the direct, almost frantic, result of Churchill's defiance. The Germans were being forced to fight a war they did not want, in a domain where their advantage was not absolute, because a single speech had convinced the nation that surrender was not an option. Back in Britain, the speech accomplished what Churchill had intended. It unified the public behind a terrifying but clear common purpose. The vague fears of invasion and defeat were given a name and a price. By offering them nothing but hardship, he gave them everything: their honor, their identity, and their future. The resolve that shocked Berlin solidified in the towns and villages of Britain. It was heard in the factories that began working double shifts, in the villages forming their local defense volunteers, and in the homes where families, listening to the wireless, felt a chill of fear, followed by a surge of grim determination. The Führer had miscalculated because he believed nations were ruled by logic alone. Churchill knew they were sustained by something else entirely: the unyielding will to remain free, whatever the cost. The stage was now set not for a negotiation, but for a duel to the death between the German eagle and the British lion. A speech does not win a war. It cannot stop a panzer division, shoot down a bomber, or build a battleship. What it can do, in the hands of master, is to transmute the leaden weight of fear into the tempered steel of resolve. Churchill's blood, toil, tears, and sweat address did not magically solve Britain's desperate strategic predicament. Instead, it performed a more profound alchemy. It reframed the very nature of the crisis. No longer was it a story of a nation on the verge of collapse, but the beginning of an epic, a trial by fire, through which national character would be forged and proven for all history. In the days and weeks that followed, the defiant words from the House of Commons began to seep into the bedrock of British society, catalyzing a psychological and social transformation that would become the foundation of the nation's unbreakable spirit. The immediate effect was the death of ambiguity. The political wrangling, the whispers of a negotiated peace, the paralyzing debate over what to do, it all ceased. Churchill's stark clarity created a unified field of reality. Everyone, from the highest lord to the most humble docker, now understood the terms of their existence. There would be a fight, it would be brutal, and the only acceptable outcome was victory or annihilation. This clarity was, paradoxically, a source of immense relief. The gnawing anxiety of the unknown was replaced by the concrete, if terrifying, certainty of the struggle. The nation now had a single, unifying purpose, a common enemy, and a leader who did not patronize them with false hope, but honored them with the grim truth. This newfound unity manifested itself with astonishing speed across the fabric of British life. The government, now operating with Churchill's relentless action this day, tempo, began to enact sweeping changes. Under Ernest Bevin, the Minister of Labor, the nation's workforce was mobilized with an efficiency that bordered on the revolutionary. Essential workers were directed to key industries, strikes were banned, and factories began operating around the clock, their output dedicated solely to the war effort. The whine of power tools and the clang of hammers became the nation's heartbeat, a percussive accompaniment to Churchill's words. This was the toil made manifest. On the ground, the spirit of defiance took physical form. The local defense volunteers, soon to be christened the Home Guard with a more martial and permanent air, swelled in number. What had begun as a makeshift force of old men and boys armed with shotguns and pitchforks began to organize into a serious, if still poorly equipped, auxiliary force. They drilled in village greens, manned roadblocks, and scanned the skies, their very existence a powerful symbol that every citizen was a soldier in this new total war. This was the blood, willingly pledged, even by those long past their fighting prime. The coming battle would be fought in the air, and Churchill knew it. He directed the nation's industrial and technological might towards the Royal Air Force. Pilots, the few to whom so much would be owed, were rushed through training. Ground crews worked miracles to service and rearm aircraft at impossible speeds. The chain of command, integrated with the revolutionary technology of radar, was streamlined for instantaneous response. The entire country became a single, integrated air defense system, its nervous system humming with electric tension. This was the preparation for the sweat and tears that the coming air battle would inevitably extract. But the transformation was not merely institutional. It was deeply personal and cultural. Churchill's language, repeated in newspapers and on the wireless, began to shape the national self-image. The British people started to see themselves not as victims of a catastrophe, but as the stalwart defenders of civilization against a monstrous tyranny. They were the underdogs, the bulldogs, the island race, standing alone. This narrative was powerfully affirming. It replaced a sense of helplessness with a sense of historic purpose. The blackout, the rationing, the fear, these were no longer mere hardships. They were shared sacrifices, badges of honor in a great moral crusade. When the storm finally broke with the onset of the Blitz in September 1940, the nation's spirit, forged in the furnace of Churchill's May speech, did not break. As bombs fell on London, Coventry, and Liverpool, the resilience was palpable. The image of the king and queen visiting bombed-out neighborhoods, the stories of ordinary people digging their neighbors out of rubble, the stubborn refusal to be cowed. This was the direct legacy of that initial, defiant stance. The spirit of the Blitz was not a spontaneous emergence. It was the culmination of a psychological preparation begun months earlier. Churchill's first speech had laid the cornerstone for this unbreakable spirit. He had not promised safety, but significance. He had not offered a way out, but a reason to stand firm. By declaring a policy of total war and an aim of total victory, and by being brutally honest about the cost, he empowered a nation. He made every citizen a stakeholder in the outcome. The speech was the spark that ignited a fire in the British soul, a fire that would burn throughout the long, dark years of the war. It transformed a collection of individuals facing terror into a nation of bulldogs who would indeed, as he later vowed, never surrender. The path ahead was drenched in blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but it was a path they now walked together, with their jaws set and their eyes fixed on a distant but certain dawn. The spirit of defiance, born in those first days of his premiership, had become Britain's most powerful weapon.